Welcome back. Tonight, we are going to spend some time together in the book of Ephesians, one of the most quietly beautiful letters ever written. This is not a story of battles or storms or dramatic miracles. It is something softer than that. It is a letter written by a man sitting in a dim room, by lamplight, who simply wanted the people he loved to know how deeply, how completely, how permanently they were treasured. Tonight, we begin at the very beginning of that letter, with a truth so large and so gentle that it has the power to quiet even the busiest, most restless mind. You were chosen before the world was made. In love, that is where we begin tonight. But before we step into the story, I want to ask you something. Right now, wherever you are, what city are you in, and what time is it where you are? Tell me in the comments. I genuinely want to know. There is something quietly wonderful about knowing that people in so many different places, at so many different hours of the night, are all settling in to hear the same ancient words together. So tell me, your city, your time. I will be reading every single one. Now, if you have not already done so, go ahead and set your phone face down, or prop it somewhere you do not have to hold it. Let your shoulders drop away from your ears. Unclench your jaw if it has been holding tension you did not notice. Adjust your pillow. Pull your blanket a little closer. You do not need to be anywhere else tonight. You do not need to solve anything, finish anything, or figure anything out. This hour belongs entirely to you. Let your body grow heavy and warm against whatever you are lying on. Let your breathing slow, just slightly, in through the nose, out through the mouth. Good. We are going somewhere peaceful tonight. All you have to do is listen. There is a coastline on the western edge of what we now call Turkey, where the Aegean Sea comes in slow and quiet against pale stones. Even now, if you stood there at night, you would understand immediately why people built cities here. The air is warm and carries salt on it, and the kind of softness that only comes from being near deep water. The stars over the Aegean are extraordinary, not the faint, washed-out stars of a city sky, but real stars, dense and generous, scattered so thickly across the darkness that the sky seems almost too full to hold them all. On a still night, the water below mirrors them perfectly, and you find yourself standing between two skies, the real one above and the reflected one below. And for a moment, the world feels very large and very quiet and very, very safe. This is where Ephesus was. Not exactly here. The ancient city sat a little inland, connected to the sea by a river and a harbour, but close enough that the people who lived there would have known this sky. The fishermen who went out before dawn would have navigated by these stars. The children who grew up in Ephesus would have fallen asleep to the distant sound of the water, the way children near the sea always do. That low, rhythmic breathing of the ocean, in and out, like something enormous and ancient and entirely unbothered. Ephesus was a real city, with real streets worn smooth by years of sandaled feet. In the early evening, when the heat of the day finally softened, people would come out of their homes and move through those streets slowly, the way people do when the air is kind. Merchants would be closing their stalls, stacking clay pots and folding bolts of linen. Old men would be sitting in doorways, watching the last of the light leave the sky. Children would be chasing each other through the narrow side streets, their laughter bouncing off stone walls and disappearing into the warm dusk. The lamp oil would be lit as the stars came out. In the poorer homes, just one lamp, a small clay dish of oil with a wick, throwing a circle of amber light just wide enough to see by. In those circles of light, families would eat their evening meal together, bread and olive oil and whatever the day had provided, and then the children would be settled onto their mats, and the adults would sit in the fading warmth and talk quietly, or simply sit, the way tired people do at the end of a long day, grateful for stillness. This is the world that Paul was writing to, not an abstract theological audience, not a conference of scholars. Ordinary people, in ordinary homes, with work-roughened hands and children who needed tending and worries that followed them into their dreams. People who knew what it felt like to lie down at the end of the day and stare at the ceiling and wonder if they were doing enough. Being enough. Living the life they were supposed to be living. People, in other words, very much like you. There is a particular kind of tiredness that has nothing to do with how much sleep you have gotten. You know the kind. It is the tiredness of carrying questions you cannot answer. The tiredness of trying very hard for a very long time and still not being entirely sure it is working. The tiredness of waking up in the night and finding your mind already moving, already rehearsing, already sorting through the list of things that are not resolved. The believers in Ephesus knew this feeling. They lived in a city that was, in many ways, exhausting. Ephesus was a place of immense religious activity. The great temple of Artemis dominated the skyline, and the whole economy of the city was wrapped around the worship that happened there. Silversmiths made small shrines to sell to pilgrims. Priests performed elaborate rituals on a schedule that never paused. The city was full of the noise and pressure of religion practiced as performance, religion practiced as social obligation, religion practiced as commerce. And into this city had come a small, quiet community of people who believed something different. They believed that the God who made everything had come close. Not in a temple made of marble, not through rituals that required expensive offerings, but personally, intimately, in the form of a man who had walked dusty roads and eaten bread with fishermen and touched the hands of people everyone else had decided were untouchable. It was a beautiful thing to believe. It was also, sometimes, a lonely thing to believe, because the world around them had not changed. The great temple still stood. The pressure to conform, to participate, to be like everyone else, that pressure was constant and quiet and wearing. And the questions that came in the night were not small questions. Am I enough? Am I truly loved? Or is this conditional? What if I am not as good as I am supposed to be? What if the doubts I have disqualify me from the grace I have been told is mine? These were the people Paul was writing to, and he knew it. He had sat with these questions himself, in darker rooms than most. So Paul begins his letter not with instructions, not with corrections, not with a list of things they need to do better. He begins with what is already true. Somewhere in Rome, in a room lit by a single lamp, with the night settling around him and the distant sounds of the city drifting through the walls, Paul picks up his pen and begins to write. And what comes out is not the careful, measured prose of someone constructing a theological argument. What comes out is something closer to wonder. Blessed, he writes, blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. And then he cannot stop, because there is too much. There is simply too much to say about what has been given, about what has been done, about the scale of the love that has been poured out. He writes about grace, and then he thinks of something else. He writes about forgiveness, and then there is wisdom, and then there is mystery, and then there is inheritance, and he keeps going, kept forward by this sense of overflow, this sense of a man trying to describe something whose edges he cannot find. Here is what he is trying to say. Underneath all the beautiful complexity, before the world was made, before the first morning, before the first tide came in against the first shore, before the first star was kindled in the first darkness, a decision was made. And the decision was about you, not about humanity in the abstract, not about a category or a group or a type, about the specific, particular, unrepeatable person that you are. The decision was this one. I want this one. I am choosing this one. In love, to be mine. That is the word Paul uses. Chosen. In love. Before the foundation of the world. There is no performance that earned this. There is no threshold you crossed. The love did not look at you and then decide. The love decided first, and you came into being inside it. The way a child is hoped for and prepared for, and then finally arrives. And the people waiting discover that the reality of this child, this specific child, is more than they could have imagined wanting. You arrived into a love that was already there, already waiting, already sure. And then Paul writes something else. Something that the people in those lamplit rooms in Ephesus would have felt land quietly in their chests. He writes about adoption. In the ancient world, adoption was not a lesser thing than blood. It was in many ways more deliberate. You chose this child. You brought this child into your household with full intention, gave them your name, made them your heir, took on their life as your own responsibility. There was nothing accidental about it, nothing provisional. And Paul says, that is what has happened to you. Not recruited, not conditionally accepted, not placed on a waiting list pending review, brought in, named, kept. The warmth in that word is not poetic decoration. It is the whole point. The God who made the stars over the Aegean, who made the soft night air and the sound of the water against pale stones, that God has made room for you in the most personal, most intimate, most irreversible way available. The lamp in Paul's room burns steadily. The night outside is quiet now. In Ephesus, the last of the market voices have faded. The children are asleep on their mats. The old men have gone inside. The stars are doing what stars do, simply being there, constant and unhurried, keeping their ancient watch over a world full of people who are loved more than they know. Paul is not finished writing. There is more he needs to say. And what comes next is perhaps even more tender than what has come before. Because knowing you are chosen is one thing. But Paul wants these tired, questioning, quietly exhausted people to understand something deeper still. He wants them to understand what they have been rescued from, and, more importantly, what they have been rescued into, the weight they have been carrying, the distance they have felt, the gap between who they are and who they wish they were. Paul is going to speak directly to all of that, gently, without condemnation, the way someone speaks when they are sitting beside you rather than standing above you. So let your breathing stay soft. Let the warmth around you hold you right where you are. There is more of this letter still to come. And the next part, it begins in a very honest place. A place you may recognize from your own quiet moments. It begins with the truth about being tired. The night has deepened now over Ephesus. The last of the lamplight has gone out in the windows along the narrow street. The market stalls are empty, the stone counters bare, the awnings folded and tied. Somewhere near the harbour, a rope creaks softly against a dock as a small boat rocks in the gentle current. That slow, patient rhythm of water that has no urgency, no agenda, no place it needs to be. The air has cooled just enough to be comfortable, carrying with it the faint smell of salt and wood smoke and the particular sweetness of night-blooming flowers that only open after the sun has gone. The city breathes, in the way that cities do at this hour. Not the held breath of tension, but the long, slow exhale of a place finally released from the demands of the day. The dogs have settled. The children are deep in their dreams. Even the great temple of Artemis, which during the day hums with the noise of pilgrims and priests and the commerce of devotion, stands quiet now on its hill, its torches burning low, its marble columns pale and still in the starlight. In one of the small homes near the edge of the city, a woman lies awake. She is not unusual in this. There are always people awake at this hour in any city, in any century. People whose minds will not release them into sleep. People who lie in the dark and find themselves visited by everything they manage to outrun during the day. She stares at the ceiling. She listens to the breathing of her husband beside her. the small sounds of her children in the next room. Everything around her is peaceful. And yet inside her, there is something that will not quite rest. She is one of the believers. She has been part of this small community of Jesus followers for several years now. She has heard the stories. She has sat in the gatherings. She has felt, genuinely felt, in moments, the warmth of something real and close and true. But tonight, in the way that the night has of stripping away the comfort of daylight certainty, she is sitting with a question she cannot quite put down. The question is not dramatic. It is not a crisis of faith, not a sudden catastrophic doubt. It is quieter than that. It is simply this: I know I am supposed to be loved, but I do not always feel like someone worth loving. You may know this feeling, not the loud version of it, not the acute, sharp pain of a specific failure or a specific rejection, the quiet version, the low, persistent background hum of not quite enoughness that follows some people through their days like a shadow they have learned to mostly ignore, until the night comes and there is nothing left to ignore it with. It is the feeling that the love you have been told about is real in general, but perhaps slightly conditional in your specific case. That the grace extended to others applies to you in a reduced form, a provisional form, a form that requires you to keep earning what you have been told is already given. That somewhere there is a ledger, and your ledger has more on the wrong side than you would like. And you are not entirely sure the books are going to balance in your favor. This is not a new feeling. It is, in fact, one of the oldest feelings in the human story. And Paul knows it. He knows it because he has felt it himself. And he knows it because he has sat with enough tired, quietly struggling people to recognize it in them. He knows that you can believe all the right things about grace and still carry the weight of self-condemnation like a stone you have simply gotten used to. So in the second chapter of his letter to the Ephesians, he does something careful and deliberate. He starts by being honest. He does not begin with encouragement. He does not begin with a list of improvements or a program for doing better. He begins by naming the thing that everyone in the room already knows, but perhaps has not said out loud. He begins with the weight. There is a word Paul uses in this chapter that translates into English as dead. Not a comfortable word. Not the kind of word that belongs in a gentle nighttime story. And yet Paul uses it tenderly. He uses it the way a doctor might name an illness. Not to frighten, not to condemn, but because naming it accurately is the first step toward understanding what the healing actually is. He says, "There was a time when you were dead in your trespasses and sins." What he means is not a dramatic, thundering condemnation. What he means is something more like, there was a time when you were cut off from the source of the thing that makes you most alive. When you were going through the motions of living while something essential was missing. The way a lamp goes through the motions of being a lamp, but gives no light when there is no oil in it. The woman lying awake in her home near the edge of Ephesus would have understood this. Not because she was a terrible person. She was not a terrible person. She was a person which means she carried the ordinary human weight of all the moments she had chosen the smaller thing over the better thing. All the times she had let fear or pride or simple inertia make her decisions for her. All the accumulated small drift of a life lived slightly sideways from the life she had somewhere, quietly, hoped to live. That drift, that gap, that low hum of not quite right, that is what Paul is naming. And he is naming it not to press it deeper, but to explain what happened to it. But God, two of the most quietly powerful words in any language, when they appear in this particular place. Paul has just finished naming the weight, all of it, honestly and without softening. And then he writes these two words, and everything turns. But God, who is rich in mercy, because of the great love with which he loved us, notice what comes first. Not the action, not what God did. The reason, the motivation, the why before the what. Rich in mercy, great love. Paul wants to make sure that what comes next is understood correctly. This is not a transaction. This is not a debt being paid off. This is not a rescue operation motivated by obligation or duty or the need to balance a cosmic ledger. This is mercy coming from richness, from an abundance, from an overflow, from a love so large that it was looking for somewhere to go. And it came toward you, not toward the version of you that has everything together, not toward the future version of you who has resolved all the things you are currently trying to resolve, toward you as you were, in the middle of the drift, in the middle of the gap, in the middle of all the small and large ways your life had wandered from its truest shape. That is where the love found you, not waiting for you to get closer, coming to where you were. There is an image that sits quietly underneath this whole chapter, and it is the image of being raised. Paul says that God, in his mercy, raised us up together and seated us in the heavenly places in Christ Jesus. Now, there is a way to read that as abstract religious language, and if you read it that way, it slides right past you without touching anything. But sit with the physical image for a moment. Someone who is raised up is someone who was down. Someone who is seated is someone who was not sitting. Someone who was, perhaps, wandering, or standing in exhaustion, or sinking, and has been brought to a place of rest. You have been given a seat, not a probationary standing near the back, not a conditional placement pending review. A seat, a settled, established, permanent place of belonging at the table. The woman lying awake in her home near the edge of Ephesus, carrying her quiet weight of not quite enoughness. She has a seat, not because she earned it, not because she has finally resolved all the things that keep her awake at night, because someone looked at the full, honest, unedited version of her and said, "This one. I want this one. Come and sit." And then Paul writes the sentence that is perhaps the most directly comforting sentence in this entire letter. For it is by grace you have been saved, through faith. And this is not from yourselves. It is the gift of God, not by works, so that no one can boast. Read that slowly, if you can. Not from yourselves. The gift of God, not by works. Paul is not saying that what you do does not matter. He will have things to say about that later in the letter, and they will matter. But here, at this foundational level, he is taking the weight of self-earning completely off the table. He is removing the possibility of the quiet, grinding anxiety that says, I must do enough to deserve this. I must maintain enough to keep this. I must perform consistently enough to hold on to this. You cannot earn it, which means you cannot lose it by failing to earn it enough. It was always a gift. It was always from love. It was always about grace. And never, not for a single moment, about whether you were impressive enough to qualify. The night over Ephesus is very still now. The woman in her home has not solved anything. Exactly. The questions she came to bed with are still questions. The gap she feels between who she is and who she wishes she were has not been closed by a formula or a program or a list of steps. But something has shifted. Slightly. The way a room shifts when someone you trust walks into it. The air does not change. The furniture does not move. But something in the quality of the stillness is different. Warmer. Less lonely. Less like a place where you are waiting for something to go wrong. She is not alone with her weight tonight. She has never been alone with it. And somewhere in Rome, by his low-burning lamp, Paul is still writing. He has more to say. He is moving now towards something that has been living in him for years. A mystery. He calls it something hidden for ages and now made known. Something about the full, breathtaking scope of what is being built. Something that, when he thinks about it, moves him to his knees. The next part of the letter is Paul at his most personal. It is Paul not as a teacher or a theologian, but as a man who has been so deeply affected by what he has seen and understood that he cannot keep it inside. He is going to pray. And the prayer he is going to pray, it is one of the most beautiful things he ever wrote. Let the warmth of this chapter stay with you as we move toward it. You are not carrying your weight alone tonight. You never were. The hour is late now. In Ephesus, the night has reached that particular depth that only comes well past midnight. The hour when even the restless have finally surrendered to sleep. When the streets are empty all the way to the edges. When the only movement is the slow drift of clouds across the stars and the occasional shimmer of the Aegean catching moonlight far below the city's hills. The air at this hour has a different quality than it does at dusk. Dusk still carries the warmth and noise of the day in it. The last of the cooking fires, the tail end of voices, the feeling of a world winding down. But this hour, this deep middle of the night hour, is something else entirely. It is genuinely still, genuinely quiet. The kind of quiet that has weight to it, that presses softly against you like a warm blanket, that asks nothing of you except that you be present inside it. The fig trees in the courtyard stand completely motionless. The olive groves on the hillsides outside the city walls are silver and dark. Silver and dark. The leaves turning slowly in a breeze so gentle it barely qualifies as wind. The harbour below is a sheet of black water stitched with the pale reflections of stars. Somewhere out past the breakwater, a single fishing boat rocks at anchor, its small lamp a warm orange point of light in all that darkness. Patient, steady, going nowhere. This is the hour for the things that cannot be said in daylight. The hour for the thoughts that wait all day for the noise to stop. The hour when the heart, finally released from the performance of managing and producing and presenting, settles into something more honest, something more tender. This is the hour when people pray. Not the formal, daylight kind of prayer that happens in public, with the right words in the right order, watched by the right people, but the other kind. The kind that happens when you are alone with the dark and you have run out of ways to be impressive, and all that is left is the truth of what you actually need, what you actually feel, what you actually hope for, spoken quietly into what you trust is a listening silence. This is the kind of prayer Paul writes about in the 3rd chapter of his letter. And to understand it fully, it helps to know where he is writing it from. Not from comfort, not from a quiet study with good light and a warm fire. Paul is in prison. The exact details of his confinement have been debated for centuries. Whether it was a formal cell, a rented room under house arrest, a space in a larger holding facility. But whatever the specific arrangement, the reality is clear enough. He is not free. He cannot leave. His movements are controlled by people who have decided he is a problem. And yet the letter he is writing contains no bitterness toward his captors, no self-pity about his circumstances, no long, elaborate explanation of how unfair his situation is and how much better things would be if he were free. What it contains instead is prayer. Specifically, prayer for the people he is writing to. He says it himself. In this chapter, he kneels before the Father. In his constrained, uncomfortable, undignified circumstances, he kneels. And what he asks for, what he reaches toward on behalf of these ordinary people in their ordinary Lamplit homes in Ephesus, is not small, not practical, not a list of manageable improvements. What he asks for is everything. There is a kind of loneliness that is very specific to people who believe. It is not the loneliness of having no one around. It is the loneliness of feeling, despite everything you have been told, despite everything you genuinely believe to be true, that the God you have given your life to is somehow slightly out of reach, present in theory, close in doctrine, but experientially, in the actual texture of your daily life, somehow behind glass. You pray, and the prayers feel like they are going somewhere, but you are not entirely sure where. You read, and the words are true. You are certain they are true, but they do not always land in the place where you most need them to land. That deep interior place where the real questions live, where the real fears sit, where the real longing for something solid and warm and undeniably close does its quiet, patient waiting. You go through the rhythms of faith, and they are good rhythms. They are sustaining rhythms. But there are nights, and you know the kind of night I mean, when you find yourself wondering if you have ever truly been close to something, or if you have been, all this time, standing just outside a warmth you cannot quite get all the way into. The believers in Ephesus felt this. They were a community surrounded by a city full of religious activity, temples and rituals and visible, tangible expressions of devotion on every street corner. The religion around them had architecture. It had priests in elaborate robes. It had smoke and ceremony and the particular psychological comfort of things you can see and touch. What the followers of Jesus had was a story, a community, a letter from a man in prison, and on the long, quiet nights, when the lamplight was low and the questions were louder than usual, some of them must have wondered, is this enough? Is this real? Is the invisible thing I have placed my hope in actually here? Or am I reaching towards something that cannot be held? Paul knows this wondering. He does not dismiss it. He kneels down and prays straight into the middle of it. Before the prayer, Paul pauses to share something he calls a mystery. Not a mystery in the sense of something frightening or unknowable, but in the older sense of the word, the sense it carried in the ancient world. A mystery was something that had been hidden, kept, waiting for the right moment to be revealed, like a gift that has been prepared for a long time and is finally, on this particular evening, being brought out and placed in your hands. The mystery Paul has been entrusted with is this, that the love of God, the rescue and the welcome and the belonging that had for so long been understood as belonging to one particular people, was always intended to extend further than anyone had imagined. Wider, more inclusive, reaching into corners and places and lives that the original story had not seemed, on the surface, to include. You are part of that mystery. Wherever you came from, whatever your background, whatever the specific shape of your wandering and your returning, the invitation that found you was not an afterthought. It was not a late addition to a plan that was originally about someone else. It was woven in from the beginning, hidden in the design of everything, waiting to be made known at exactly the right moment. Paul says he is the least of all the saints, and he means it. He knows what he was before. He knows the weight of what he did and who he was and how far he stood from anything that could be called grace. And if the mystery reached him, in all of that, then you begin to understand how far the reach actually goes. It goes all the way. It goes all the way to wherever you are. And then Paul kneels in his constrained, uncomfortable room, with the sounds of Rome outside his window and the chains that have marked his wrists still fresh in his memory. Paul kneels down before the Father and he begins to ask. He asks that you would be strengthened, not strengthened in the way that a soldier is strengthened for battle, toughened, hardened, made capable of enduring more punishment, strengthened in the inner being, the deep interior place, the place where you are most honestly yourself, most tired, most hungry, most in need of something solid to hold on to. He is asking for that place, specifically, to be touched. He asks that Christ would dwell in your heart through faith. Dwell, not visit, not pass through, not make occasional appearances when the circumstances are right. Dwell, which means settle, which means stay, which means make a home. The image is of a house that has been lived in for a long time by someone who loves it. Not a house that is kept perfect for company, that holds its breath, waiting for the important guest who may or may not arrive. A house with worn spots on the floor where someone always stands to look out the window. A house that smells of cooking and has blankets left on the couch and knows, in the way that lived-in houses know things, that it is not empty. That is the image Paul has in mind for your heart. Not a formal, carefully prepared space waiting for a distant God to condescend to visit. A home, warm and real and inhabited. And then he asks for something that stops him mid-sentence, because the thing he is trying to describe is simply larger than the words available to him. He asks that you would be able to comprehend, with all the saints, together, because this is too big for any one person to hold alone, the width and length and height and depth of something that he then immediately says surpasses knowledge. He wants you to know the unknowable. He wants you to experience the love of Christ, which cannot be fully contained in any concept or any formula or any theological system, but which can be, and this is the remarkable claim, actually felt, actually encountered, actually known in the way that you know warmth when you are cold and finally come inside. Width, length, height, depth. He goes in all four directions because he wants you to understand that there is no direction in which the love does not extend. There is no edge of it. There is no corner you can wander into where it thins out and finally gives way to something else. Wherever you go, whatever you have done, however far you have drifted in whatever direction, the love is already there, has always been there, is waiting there, patient and warm, for you to arrive. And then he asks that you would be filled with all the fullness of God. Just that. All of it. Everything. Not a portion, not a measured allocation appropriate to your current level of spiritual development. The fullness. This is the prayer of a man who is in prison and should by any reasonable measure be asking for smaller things. This is the prayer of a man who has decided that the people he loves deserve to be prayed for extravagantly, because the God he is praying to is extravagant, because the love he has encountered has no ceiling, and he will not insult it by asking small. The lamp in Paul's room burns on, Outside, Rome sleeps, or does not sleep. Rome is a city that never goes entirely quiet, that always has some layer of activity running beneath the surface, even in its deepest hours. But in this room, there is a stillness, the stillness of a man who has just prayed everything he had, who has placed the people he loves into hands larger than his own and let himself rest in that. He writes one more line before he pauses. He writes about the God who is able to do far more abundantly than all we ask or think. Far more abundantly than all we ask or think. Sit with that for a moment. Whatever you have been hoping for tonight, whatever quiet, careful, half-formed hope you have been carrying, the one you have maybe not even said out loud because you were not sure it was reasonable to hope for it, Paul is saying that the capacity of the love you have been welcomed into exceeds even that, goes beyond even the most generous thing your imagination can construct. You are not hoping for too much. You may not be hoping for nearly enough. Let that thought move through you gently as we continue. Because next, Paul is going to turn from prayer to practice. From the vast, breathtaking sky of what God has done, to the question of how people who have been given this much actually live together, how they treat each other, how they navigate difference and difficulty and the ordinary friction of being human in close proximity to other humans. And what he has to say about that is gentler and more specific and more quietly radical than you might expect. The mystery has been revealed. Now comes the question of how to walk inside it. There is a particular kind of morning that comes after a long, still night. Not the dramatic kind of morning. Not the sunrise that blazes up over the horizon in oranges and reds like something announcing itself. The quiet kind. The kind where the light comes in so gradually that you cannot point to the moment it began. One moment the sky is deep blue-black, the stars still clear and unhurried. Then, without any single instant of transition, the darkness begins to soften at the edges. The stars nearest the horizon fade first, not disappearing so much as being gently absorbed into a growing tenderness in the sky. The air shifts almost imperceptibly. A fraction cooler, a fraction more alive, carrying the first faint green smell of things that have been sleeping and are now, slowly, beginning to wake. In Ephesus, this morning light would have come first to the hilltops. The temple of Artemis would have caught it earliest, its white marble columns warming from grey to pale gold as the light found them, the whole structure taking on a softness it did not have in the full glare of noon. Then the light would have moved down into the city, filling the wider streets first, then the narrower ones, pooling in doorways and courtyards, catching the leaves of the fig trees and turning them briefly luminous before settling into the ordinary green of day. The city would have stirred slowly. A baker, up before anyone else, sliding flat bread into a clay oven, the smell of it drifting out into the street before the street was awake enough to notice. A woman at a well, drawing water in the cool before the heat of the day made the walk unpleasant. Her movements quiet and habitual, her mind still half in the dreams she had left behind. Children beginning to surface from their sleep, the way children do, suddenly, all at once, without the gradual reluctance of adults, sitting up in their beds with an immediacy that adults have mostly lost. And in the homes where the believers gathered, the day would have begun with a particular awareness. These were people who had been told, by the letter they had received, that they were chosen, that they were loved, that they carried within them a mystery so large and so generous that it could not be fully measured in any direction. They had heard these things read aloud into lamplight. They had let the words settle into them in the quiet of the night. And now morning had come. And with morning came the actual texture of their actual lives. Their neighbors, their families, their fellow believers, with all of the particular quirks and friction points and unresolved tensions that came with being human beings in close proximity to other human beings. The lofty truths of the night before had not dissolved. They were real, they were sustaining, but now they needed to be walked in, lived in, practiced, day by day, in the ordinary circumstances of a city that was not always kind. This is where Paul's letter turns. There is a gap that almost everyone who has ever tried to live by faith has felt. It is the gap between what you believe and how you behave, between the person you understand yourself to be in your best, most honest moments, loved, chosen, held, belonging to something vast and good, and the person who actually shows up in the friction of daily life, who gets impatient in the market when the line is slow, who says the cutting thing when they could have said nothing, who finds the differences between themselves and the people around them easier to catalogue than the things they share. The believers in Ephesus knew this gap. They were a community made up of people from very different backgrounds. Jewish believers and Gentile believers. People from different social classes. People with different histories and different temperaments and different ways of understanding what this new life was supposed to look like. The miracle of their coming together was genuine and real. But so was the friction. Because people are people. Even people who have been given everything Paul described in the first 3 chapters of this letter. Even those people wake up in the morning carrying their old habits and their old wounds and their old ways of protecting themselves. Even those people find it easier to be patient with some people than with others. Even those people have moments where the gap between who they are trying to be and who they actually are feels less like a gentle challenge and more like an accusation. The question Paul is now turning to is not whether this gap exists. He knows it exists. The question is how to walk across it. Gently, he says, with humility and gentleness and patience, bearing with one another in love. 4 words that are easy to read and surprisingly difficult to live. Not because they describe an impossible standard, but because they describe a very specific kind of daily choosing. The kind that does not happen once, in a dramatic moment of decision, but hundreds of times a day, in the small and unremarkable circumstances where your actual character is formed. There is also another kind of weight that some of the Ephesian believers were carrying. The weight of feeling out of place. Not everyone in this community had the same gifts, the same role, the same sense of obvious purpose. Some people knew clearly what they were there to do. Others looked around and wondered what exactly they contributed, whether they were truly needed, whether the body, as Paul was beginning to call this community, would function any differently if they quietly removed themselves from it. This is not an abstract concern. It is one of the most common and most quietly painful experiences in any community of faith. The sense that others have been given something vivid and visible and clearly useful, while what you have been given is harder to name. Smaller, perhaps, less impressive, less necessary. Paul is going to address this directly. But first he wants to establish something foundational, something that everything else rests on. He wants to talk about oneness. One body, one spirit, one hope, one Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all. Paul lists these 7 oneness statements in a row, and the repetition is not accidental. He is doing something deliberate with the rhythm of it, building a kind of foundation, stone by stone, that he wants the Ephesian believers to feel under their feet before he asks them to walk anywhere. The oneness is not something they are trying to achieve. It is something that already exists. This is a crucial distinction, and it is easy to miss. Paul is not saying, try harder to be unified. Work at your differences until you have smoothed them away. He is saying, the unity is already real, already given, already established in something deeper than your agreements and disagreements. Your job is not to create it. Your job is to keep it, to maintain, with gentleness and patience, something that has already been made. The image he uses is a body, and a body is instructive precisely because of how its parts relate to each other. A body does not require all of its parts to be the same in order to function. It requires them to be connected. A hand that tried to do everything a foot does would not be a better hand. It would be a confused and ineffective one. A hand that knows what it is and does what it does with the full investment of its function contributes something that nothing else in the body can provide. Every part is needed, not the impressive parts only, not the visible parts only, not the parts with the gifts that are easiest to name and admire. Every part doing the specific thing it was made to do, in connection with all the other parts doing their specific things. That is what makes the whole body grow. He says it plainly, from whom the whole body, joined and held together by every joint with which it is equipped, when each part is working properly, makes the body grow so that it builds itself up in love. When each part is working properly, not when each part is working impressively, not when each part is performing at the level of the most gifted parts. Properly, faithfully, in the specific way that particular part was made to work, contributing the specific thing that particular part was made to contribute. And then Paul says something that might be the most practically useful thing in the entire letter. He says, put off the old self, put on the new. Now, this is easy to spiritualize into abstraction, to turn into a vague aspiration toward general improvement that means everything and requires nothing specific. But Paul is not being vague. He follows the general statement with a very particular list of exchanges. Stop lying. Speak truth. Do not let anger harden into something that feeds itself overnight. Let it pass before the sun goes down. Stop stealing. Work honestly. And then give from what you have to the person who has less. Stop letting what comes out of your mouth tear people down. Let what comes out build people up instead. Give grace. He says, give grace with your words. Stop being bitter. Stop being angry in the chronic, nursing way. Stop being unkind. Stop being harsh. Forgive each other. He says, the way you have been forgiven. Each of these is small. Each of these is a daily, ordinary, unspectacular choice made in the actual circumstances of an actual life. In the market, in the home, in the community gathering, in the private space of a mind deciding how to process a slight or a disappointment. And each of these, done consistently, over time, is how a person who has been given everything gradually becomes, in the actual texture of their lived experience. Someone who knows they have been given everything. The theology moves into the body. The truth becomes a life. Paul pauses near the end of this section of the letter and writes a sentence that is very easy to read past. He says, "Do not grieve the Holy Spirit of God, by whom you were sealed for the day of redemption." It is easy to read this as a warning, another item on the list of things to avoid. But read it again, more slowly. The Holy Spirit can be grieved. Grief is not the emotion of indifference. Grief is not what you feel about something that does not matter to you. Grief is what happens when something you love is hurt, or when something you hoped for does not happen, or when a relationship that matters to you is strained. The God who chose you before the world was made, who raised you up and seated you in the heavenly places, who prays over you with a love wider and longer and higher and deeper than anything you can measure. That God, Paul is saying, has feelings about how you treat the people around you. Not the feelings of a disappointed authority figure tallying your failures. The feelings of someone who loves you and loves the people around you and wants, genuinely and warmly wants, to see you walk gently with each other. Be kind. Paul writes, tender-hearted, forgiving one another. 3 words that contain, between them, an entire way of moving through the world. The morning light has fully arrived in Ephesus now. The city is awake. The market is open. The streets are filling with the ordinary noise of ordinary life. Voices bargaining and greeting and arguing and laughing. Children running. Donkeys loaded with goods moving through the wider streets with patient indifference to the humans around them. And somewhere in this city, the people who received Paul's letter are moving through their day. One of them is choosing, in a small moment that no one else will notice, to say the gentle thing instead of the cutting thing. One of them is sitting with an old bitterness and deciding, quietly, to set it down, not because it is easy, but because they have been told what they have been given, and the gift is too large to carry alongside the bitterness without something eventually breaking. One of them is doing their work, their ordinary, unspectacular, not particularly impressive work, with the quiet knowledge that it matters, that they are a part of something, that the specific thing they contribute, however small it looks from the outside, is genuinely needed by the whole. This is what it looks like. Paul is saying, to walk worthy of the calling you have received. Not spectacular, not dramatic, mostly unremarkable from the outside, but underneath, in the unseen places, something is being built, something that does not decay. And now, as the day moves forward and the light grows full and warm over the city, Paul wants to talk about something that he has been building toward since the very beginning of the letter, about the difference between darkness and light, not as abstract concepts, but as lived realities, about what it actually looks like in the skin and breath and daily choices of a real person living a real life. To be, as he puts it, children of light. The night is behind us now. The day is here. And there is something beautiful Paul wants to say about what it means to live in it. There is a moment in the very early morning, before the sun has fully risen, when the world exists in a kind of in-between. Not night anymore. Not yet day. The darkness has thinned but not dissolved. The shapes of things, the rooftops, the trees, the outline of the hills beyond the city, are visible now, but only just. Soft and approximate, their edges blurred by the remaining dark, like objects seen through gauze. The birds have begun, tentatively, a few uncertain notes that sound less like singing and more like questions. Is it time? Is it safe? Is the light really coming? And then, gradually, it is. Not all at once. Not in a rush. The light comes the way kindness comes from someone who has learned to be patient, slowly, steadily, without drama, filling in the spaces between things before it fills the things themselves. First, the sky lightens to a deep blue, then to something softer, then to the palest imaginable grey gold at the horizon. The birds grow more confident. The shapes of things become shapes, then objects, then themselves. Colour returns to the world. Slowly, gently, like memory returning after a long sleep. The green of the olive leaves, the pale stone of the road, the terracotta warmth of the rooftops. Ephesus would have woken like this every morning. The harbour catching the first light first, the water going from black to silver to a tentative, shimmering blue, the fishermen already out in their boats, having navigated by starlight, Now watching the light come and feeling the particular satisfaction of people who have been awake to witness the world's daily return to itself. The temple on the hill emerging from shadow, its columns resolving from grey shapes into the clean, specific white that the full day would reveal. And in the homes of the believers, people stirring from sleep into this light, carrying with them, perhaps without fully noticing, the particular quality of consciousness that belongs to early morning, that brief, a soft window before the day's demands have fully assembled themselves, when the mind is still close to the honesty of sleep, still permeable, still open to things that the busier hours tend to close off. This is the window Paul is writing into. This is the tenderness he is reaching toward when he begins to talk about light. Not the blinding, exposing light of high noon, the light that shows every flaw, that leaves no shadows to rest in, that demands you be seen clearly whether you are ready or not. That is not the light Paul has in mind. The light he is describing is more like this morning light over Ephesus. Gentle, arriving, finding things in the dark, not to condemn them for having been there, but simply to make them visible, to restore their color and their shape, to call them back into the warmth of the day. This is important to hold on to as we move through this chapter, because it is easy, when someone begins to talk about light and darkness in the context of faith, to hear it as a sorting mechanism, a division of the world into the acceptable and the unacceptable, the clean and the unclean, the ones who are in the light and the ones who are in the dark. And if that is how you hear it, the light becomes something to be afraid of, rather than something to be grateful for. Paul is not sorting. Paul is inviting. Come into the light, he is saying. Not because you have to, not because the dark is being punished, but because you were made for this. Because the light is where you come most fully alive. Because there is warmth here, and clarity here, and a way of moving through the world that costs less and gives more than the alternative. There is a kind of living that is very easy to fall into without quite deciding to. It happens gradually, the way all drifts happen, not in a single dramatic choice, but in 100 small ones, each one individually so minor that it barely registers. A small compromise here, a small avoidance there, a habit that starts as an exception and becomes, over time, a pattern, a way of managing the discomfort of being fully seen that slowly becomes a way of hiding from others, from yourself, from the honest accounting of what you are actually doing with your life. Paul calls this walking in darkness, and he does not say it as a condemnation. He says it almost as a description of something he understands from the inside, the way someone who has been lost in a fog and found their way out might describe fog to someone still in it. Not to make them feel ashamed of being in the fog, just to say, I know what it is like in there. And I also know there is something different available. Something better. The believers in Ephesus knew both sides of this. Many of them had come from lives shaped by the culture around them. A culture that had its own values, its own rhythms, its own definitions of what mattered and what was acceptable. And those values and rhythms did not simply disappear when someone came to faith. They lived in the body. They lived in the habit. They lived in the automatic responses and the unexamined assumptions that are the actual texture of a life. There would have been people in that community who were genuinely trying, genuinely orienting themselves toward the light, genuinely wanting to live differently, and still finding that certain old patterns had a pull to them that was hard to name and harder to resist. Not because they were bad people, because they were people. Because the grooves worn into us by years of living a certain way are real grooves, and changing direction does not instantly smooth them away. Paul knows this. He is not surprised by it. But he wants to offer something more useful than shame. There is a line in this chapter that is so quiet it is easy to miss, but it contains something remarkable. Paul writes, "Wake up, sleeper, rise from the dead, and Christ will shine on you." Wake up, sleeper. Not shame on you for sleeping. Not how dare you still be asleep. Not even you really should have woken up by now. Just wake up. The way you might say it to someone you love. Gently, in the early morning, touching their shoulder, keeping your voice soft. Not wanting to startle them, but wanting them to see the morning that has arrived while they were sleeping. Not angry at them for sleeping, simply inviting them into the day that is already here. Already beautiful, already full of the particular quality of light that belongs to early morning and will not last forever. Christ will shine on you. The light is not withheld pending improvement. The light is not conditional on having already been awake. The light comes toward you. It finds you where you are. It shines on you. The sleeping one, the drifting one, the one who has been in the fog for longer than they meant to be. And the shining itself is what wakes you. You do not wake yourself up in order to deserve the light. The light comes and you open your eyes. Paul uses a word in this chapter that appears simple and turns out to be everything. The word is walk. Walk as children of light, he says. Walk carefully. Walk wisely. Not run. Not perform. Not achieve or conquer or transform yourself through heroic spiritual effort. Walk. There is something in the choice of that word that deserves to be felt rather than analyzed. Walking is sustainable. Walking is the pace at which you can actually see what is around you. Walking is what human beings were designed for. The speed at which our bodies move most naturally. The rhythm at which our minds can keep up with our feet, and our feet can keep up with our minds. Faith walked is different from faith performed. Faith walked is what happens in the ordinary days. Not the days of high spiritual experience or dramatic breakthrough, but the Tuesday mornings and the Thursday afternoons and the unremarkable stretches of life that make up most of a life. The daily decision to be honest when a small dishonesty would be easier. The daily choice to be present with the person in front of you rather than elsewhere in your mind. The daily practice of gratitude, which Paul describes here as giving thanks always for everything. A practice so simple that it sounds trivial and turns out in actual lived experience, to be quietly transformative. He also says something in this chapter about time. Make the best use of the time. He writes, because the days are evil. This has sometimes been read as a kind of urgency that tips into anxiety. Hurry. Work harder. Do more before it is too late. But that is not quite what Paul is saying. He is saying something closer to pay attention. Do not let the days simply happen to you. Do not drift through the hours in the half-conscious way that the pressures and distractions of life can pull you into. Be awake inside your life. Notice what is happening around you. Notice where the light is. Walk toward it, deliberately and steadily, one ordinary step at a time. And then Paul turns to something intimate. He begins to talk about the closest relationships, the ones that happen inside a household, inside a family, inside the daily shared life of people who have chosen each other. And what he says here has sometimes been read in ways that have caused real harm, and it is worth pausing to understand what he is actually doing. He is describing a radical mutuality. The word he uses, submit, appears in this passage in a form that applies first and most broadly to everyone toward everyone. Submit to one another, he says, out of reverence for Christ. Before he says anything about any specific relationship, he establishes this general principle in the community of faith. The posture is mutual deference, not hierarchy for its own sake, not power for its own sake, but the particular kind of strength that is willing to place itself in service of the other. And then he describes what that looks like in the closest relationships. He uses the image of Christ and the church, a relationship defined not by the powerful party exercising dominion, but by the powerful party giving themselves completely. Loving, he says, as Christ loved the church and gave himself for her. The giving is the definition. The love that is being held up as the model here is not the love of someone who has the power and uses it carefully, who condescends graciously from a position of authority. It is the love of someone who had everything and chose freely to give it, to serve, to put the other first, to measure the relationship not by what they were owed, but by what they could give. This is the light Paul is talking about. Finally, in its most specific and most demanding form. Not the abstract light of doctrine, the light of a life where the people closest to you, on ordinary mornings when nothing important is happening, are consistently treated with the fullness of what they deserve, which is the same fullness that has been given to you. The morning light over Ephesus has deepened now into the full warmth of day. The dew on the rooftop gardens has burned off. The shadows have shortened and moved. The harbour is busy with the ordinary commerce of a port city. Boats coming and going. Voices calling across the water. The particular music of a place that has been doing this same work for generations and expects to keep doing it. In the homes of the believers, the day is fully underway. Meals are being prepared. Children are being tended. Work is being done. The daily, necessary, unglamorous work of keeping a life and a household functioning. Relationships are being navigated in real time, with all the patience and all the failure and all the small recoveries that real relationships involve. And somewhere in all of this ordinary dailiness, a person pauses, just for a moment, not to pray at length, not to have a spiritual experience, just to remember, in the middle of an ordinary moment, that they are a child of light, that the love they carry within them is not their own, that the patience they are trying to extend to the person in front of them right now is not coming from their own reserves, which are limited, but from something that does not run out. That is enough. That moment of remembering, that tiny, quiet reorientation in the middle of an ordinary day is enough. Paul has one more thing to say before his letter is finished. And it is the most practical thing he will say. And also, underneath the practical, the most tender, he is going to talk about the things we carry. The armor we put on not to go to war but to remain standing. Simply, faithfully, peacefully standing in the middle of a world that pushes against us in ways we can feel but cannot always see. He is going to talk about how to stay, how to remain, how to stand at the end of a long day, having done what you could do, having been who you were trying to be, and find that you are still upright, still held, still, somehow, in the light. The day is almost done now. Let the warmth of it settle around you. The last chapter of this letter is almost here. The afternoon light in Ephesus has a particular quality that the morning light does not have. Where the morning light is tentative and cool and full of possibility, the afternoon light is settled. It has committed to being here. It falls at an angle now, coming in long and warm and golden from the west, the kind of light that makes ordinary things look like they have been considered. The stone wall of a courtyard catching it and glowing faintly amber, the dust motes in a doorway turning suddenly into something luminous and slow, the leaves of the olive trees becoming briefly translucent, each one holding the light for a moment before releasing it. This is the light that falls on families, on the part of the day that belongs to the people who are closest to you, not the public hours of commerce and obligation, but the private hours of the household. The hours when the door closes on the street and what is left is the people you have chosen, or been given, or grown alongside. The hours when the performance of the day can be set down, and what remains is simply the reality of being in close proximity to other human beings whom you love and who are, inevitably, complicated. In the homes of Ephesus, these afternoon and evening hours had a rhythm. The older children helping with the younger ones, or with the work of the household, carrying water, grinding grain, tending the small garden plots that provided the daily vegetables. The adults moving through the familiar choreography of shared domestic life, each person knowing their part, the whole household functioning as a kind of living organism with its own internal logic and its own accumulated history. And yet, in every household, In every family in every century, there is also the friction, the small, daily friction of people who know each other too well to pretend, who have seen each other at the worst hours, who carry the accumulated weight of old misunderstandings and unresolved tensions, who love each other genuinely and still, sometimes, find each other genuinely difficult. Paul knows this household. He has stayed in enough of them across his years of traveling and teaching and being welcomed in by strangers who became friends. He has eaten meals in homes where the warmth was real and the tension was also real, where the grace being extended around the table was harder to maintain than the grace being talked about at the gathering. He knows that the most demanding classroom for the truths he has been writing about is not the assembly of believers, but the kitchen, the courtyard, the shared sleeping room where people who love each other lie awake, listening to each other's breathing and thinking thoughts they would not say out loud. This is where Paul turns now, not away from the grand truths, into them, into the specific, daily, unglamorous places where the grand truths either become real or remain merely beautiful ideas. There is a particular kind of loneliness that exists inside closeness. It is not the loneliness of being alone. That loneliness has its own texture, its own weight, and it is real. But this other kind, the loneliness of being in close proximity to someone and still feeling unseen, still feeling like the version of you that most needs to be known, is not the version that is being related to. This is perhaps the more quietly painful of the two. It happens in marriages where two people have learnt each other's surfaces thoroughly and somewhere along the way stopped reaching for anything deeper. It happens between parents and children who love each other and have somehow, over the years, developed a script, a set of expected exchanges, predictable responses, established roles that keeps them safe and connected, and at the same time slightly distant from the fullness of what they might be to each other. It happens in the most ordinary households, in the most ordinary afternoons, between people who chose each other and would choose each other again and still, sometimes, feel the gap between the love they carry and the love they manage to actually express. The believers in Ephesus felt this, not because they were failing at faith, because they were human, because the transformation that Paul has been describing throughout this letter is real, but it is also gradual. It works its way through a person the way the morning light works its way through a city. Not all at once, not in a single dramatic illumination, but slowly, steadily, reaching into the corners last. And in some of the corners of these households, there were old patterns, old ways of relating that had been learned before faith arrived and had not yet been fully renegotiated. Old assumptions about roles and power and who owed what to whom. Old wounds that had not been spoken about. Old apologies that had not been made. Old distances that had become so familiar they no longer registered as distances. Paul is going to speak directly to some of this, not to make anyone feel worse about it, to offer a different way of seeing it. There is also something else happening in this chapter that is worth naming before we move into it. Paul is writing, in part, to people who are navigating a world that does not share their values, the household codes of the ancient world, the established patterns for how families and households were supposed to function, were not neutral. They were shaped by a culture that assumed certain hierarchies, certain arrangements of power, certain answers to the questions of who mattered and who mattered less. The believers in Ephesus were trying to live as a community of people who had been told that in Christ there is a fundamental equality, that the divisions and hierarchies that the surrounding culture took for granted were not the final word about how human beings were meant to relate to each other. And they were trying to do this inside households that existed in that same surrounding culture. They were trying to hold two things at once: the truth they had been given and the world they were actually living in, and figure out, day by day, what faithfulness looked like in the specific circumstances of their specific lives. This is not so different from what you are doing. Paul begins this section with something that could easily be read as a series of instructions and is, underneath, something more like an invitation. He talks about children and parents, specifically about children honoring their parents, and about parents not provoking their children to anger, but bringing them up in the nurture and instruction of the Lord. The word he uses for nurture is a word that carries warmth in it. It is not the word for discipline in the harsh, corrective sense. It is the word for the tender, attentive, careful raising of something that is growing, the way you tend a young tree, not by forcing it into shape, but by giving it what it needs and making space for it to become what it was made to be. And the instruction he gives to parents, do not provoke your children to anger, is, when you sit with it, a remarkably child-centered piece of advice for its time. In a culture that largely understood children as the property of their parents, to be shaped according to the parents' wishes with little reference to the child's inner experience, Paul is saying, pay attention to what you are doing to the interior of this small person. Be careful with their capacity for anger. Be mindful of what you are building in them by how you treat them. The love being asked for here is not the love of authority being exercised wisely. It is something more like the love of someone who remembers what it was like to be small and unheard, and has decided not to pass that experience on. And then Paul returns to the theme he introduced in the previous chapter, the theme of mutual love, of the kind of giving that does not keep score. He describes a marriage the way he described Christ and the church, not as a hierarchy of authority and submission, but as a mystery of love, so complete and so self-giving that the categories of power begin to dissolve inside it. A love where the question is not who has the right to demand what, but who can give more. Where each person is trying to outdo the other, not in control, but in care. Where the daily choices, the small, unremarkable, unwitnessed choices of two people living a life together are oriented consistently toward the flourishing of the other person. This is very hard. Paul does not pretend it is not hard. But he has spent 3 chapters establishing why it is possible. Because the love required for this is not generated from inside you. It flows from the love that chose you before the world was made. It is resourced by the grace that found you in the fog and did not let go. It is sustained by the Spirit that dwells in you, not as a visitor, but as a resident. Not on special occasions, but in the ordinary afternoons, when the light falls warm and golden through the window, and someone you love is being difficult, and you have to decide, for perhaps the 100th time today, who you are going to be. The decision, made 100 times, becomes a character. The character, formed over years, becomes a life. And the life, looked back on from the long view, is the thing that matters. There is a word that appears near the end of this section of Paul's letter that I want to stay with for a moment. The word is rooted. He used it earlier in the letter, when he prayed that the Ephesian believers would be rooted and grounded in love, established so deeply in love that they could bear the weight of trying to measure something immeasurable. Now, in the context of household and relationship and the daily practice of living with other people, that word comes back. Rooted. A tree that is rooted is not a tree that never moves. The branches move. The leaves move. In a strong wind, the whole canopy moves, bending and swaying and making the full extent of its flexibility visible. But underneath, in the dark and the quiet where no one can see, the roots hold. They have gone down far enough and wide enough that the movement above ground, however dramatic it looks, is not the same as being uprooted. Rooted in love means that the ordinary turbulences of relationship, the misunderstandings, the disappointments, the seasons of distance, the moments of friction, do not constitute a fundamental threat to the thing itself. They are the branches bending. They are the leaves moving in the wind. The roots are holding. The roots have been going down since before the world was made, in the love that chose you and has not changed its mind. You are not restless. Not really. Not at the deepest level. You may feel restless. The surface may be in motion. But underneath, in the place where the real you lives, in the place where Paul has been speaking all along, there is something solid, something that does not shift with the wind. You are rooted. The golden afternoon light in Ephesus is fading now. The long shadows are lengthening, merging, beginning to lose their edges as the light softens toward evening. The harbour is quieting. The market has closed. The children, who have been running and shouting since the afternoon cooled enough to permit it, are being called in by voices that carry that particular quality of evening. Tired, warm, ready for the day to end. In the households of the believers, the lamps are being lit. One by one, the small clay dishes of oil are kindled, and the circles of amber light appear in the windows, and the homes take on the particular intimacy of evening. The whole world shrunk down to the size of a room, the darkness outside making the light inside feel more valuable, more worth protecting. Paul is almost at the end of his letter. He has said so much. He has traced the full arc from before the world began to the ordinary afternoon kitchen. From the breathtaking cosmic scope of what God has done to the very specific question of how to speak to a child or love a spouse on a difficult day. And now, at the very end, he has one more gift to offer. Not a new idea, not another instruction. Something more like armor, and yet softer than armor sounds. More like covering, like protection, like the way a good blanket wraps around you on a cold night and makes the cold outside feel distant and manageable. He is going to talk about how to face the darkness without being afraid of it. How to stand when standing is hard. How to be held at the end of everything by the same love that chose you at the beginning. The lamps are lit now in Ephesus. The stars are beginning to appear, one by one, in the deep blue sky above the sea. It is almost time to rest. But first, Paul has one more thing to say, and it is worth staying awake for. The night has come back to Ephesus, fully now, completely, the way night comes when it is not fighting with anything. The last of the evening colour long gone from the western sky. The stars fully present and unhurried in the deep darkness above the Aegean. The sea below the city is invisible except where the moonlight catches it, laying a long, trembling path of silver across the water from the horizon to the shore, shifting slightly with each small movement of the surface, patient and luminous and entirely indifferent to the passage of time. The city is quiet, not the strained, effortful quiet of a place trying to be still, the natural quiet of a place that has finished its day and released itself into rest. The market streets are empty. The stones cool now after the warmth they absorbed through the long hours of sun. The harbour is a dark mirror. The great temple on the hill stands pale and still against the sky, its torches burning low, its enormous presence reduced by the night to something almost gentle. Just another shape in the darkness, no more imposing than the hills behind it. In the homes of the believers, most of the lamps have been extinguished. The oil is precious, and the day begins early. The children are deeply asleep, the small unconscious sleep of people who have not yet learned to carry their worries into the night. The adults have settled onto their mats, into the warmth of their blankets, the familiar smell of their homes around them, wood smoke and lamp oil and bread and the particular scent of the people they love close by. The letter from Paul has been read more than once, perhaps read aloud at the gathering, then talked about afterward, then turned over quietly in individual minds through the days since. Its words have had time to begin their slow work, the way seeds work, invisibly, beneath the surface, before anything visible appears. And now it is night, and the letter has one more thing to say. Somewhere in Rome, Paul is also in the night. He is not free, but he has learned, and this is one of the quiet miracles of his life, to be at peace in places that are not peaceful. He has learned, as he wrote in another letter, to be content in whatever state he finds himself, not because the difficult things are not difficult, because underneath the difficulty, There is something that the difficulty cannot reach. Something that was established before he was born and will remain after everything else has changed. He picks up his pen one last time. He has been building toward this final section since the very beginning. Through the breathless wonder of the first chapter, through the tender honesty of the second, through the prayer that moved him to his knees in the third, through the gentle, practical wisdom of the fourth and fifth and sixth, the slow descent from the cosmic to the household, from the eternal to the everyday. Now he arrives at the end, and the end is not a summary. It is not a conclusion. It is an image, a soldier standing in the dark, not fighting, not advancing, simply standing, holding the ground that has been given, remaining upright in the place where they have been placed, weathering what comes without being moved from where they belong. This is the last picture Paul wants to leave in the minds of the people he loves. Not triumphant, not spectacular, simply standing, still there. There is a kind of weariness that comes not from any single large thing, but from the accumulated weight of many small ones. You know this weariness. It is the weariness of a long faithfulness, of trying, day after day, to be the person you are trying to be, in circumstances that do not always cooperate, of loving people who are sometimes difficult to love, of holding on to hope in seasons when hope feels like the least rational response to the available evidence, of standing for things that the world around you does not particularly value, in ways that are rarely dramatic and almost never recognized. It is not a crisis weariness. It is a long road weariness, the kind that does not announce itself with any single moment of collapse, but simply accumulates quietly, until one day you notice that you are more tired than you expected to be, more worn than the circumstances seem to warrant, and you are not entirely sure when exactly the tiredness got this deep. The believers in Ephesus knew this. They were people who had taken on, simply by virtue of their faith, a way of living that ran against the grain of the world around them. The values Paul described in the preceding chapters, the gentleness, the honesty, the radical mutuality, the forgiveness, the patience, these were not values that the surrounding culture reinforced. There was no social reward for practicing them. There was often a social cost. And beyond the simple friction of daily countercultural living, there were things they could not fully see or name, pressures and resistances that felt larger than any individual source, that seemed to come from somewhere beyond the merely human, that could not be resolved by being kinder or more patient or more disciplined. Paul names this honestly. He says, "Our struggle is not against flesh and blood." It is not, ultimately, a struggle with other people, though it often feels that way. The person who is difficult, the relationship that drains you, the circumstance that will not resolve, these are real and they are genuinely hard. But Paul is saying that underneath all of that, there is something else. A resistance that is structural, that is older than any individual conflict. that is not going to be defeated by being clever or determined or spiritually impressive. And then he says something that reframes everything. You do not have to defeat it. You have to stand. Put on the full armor of God. It is a military image, and it has sometimes been read with a military energy. Aggressive, combative, ready for battle, looking for the fight. But Paul does not use it that way. He uses it 3 times in this passage, and each time the purpose is the same, so that you may be able to stand. Stand, stand, stand. Not advance, not conquer, not defeat. Stand, which means remain upright, which means hold the ground that has been given, which means be still in the place where you belong and let what comes, come without being swept away by it. The armor is not for going to war. The armor is for surviving the night. So let us put it on together, slowly, gently, the way you might help a tired child into warm clothes before sleep. Not rushed, not effortful, simply one piece at a time. The belt of truth. This is the first piece, and it goes around the center, around the core of you. Truth is what holds everything else in place. Not impressive truth, not complicated truth, simply the willingness to know what is actually real. About yourself, about your life, about the God who made you. The belt of truth means you are not trying to hold yourself together with stories that are not quite honest. The real story, the full, unedited, sometimes uncomfortable real story, is also the only story that truth can work with. And truth, Paul has been saying all along, is the most liberating thing available to you. It is what the morning light does. It does not invent a better version of things. It simply shows you what is actually there. Let that settle around your center tonight. You do not have to pretend tonight. The righteousness of Christ, worn over the chest like a breastplate. This is the peace that covers the heart, the place where you are most vulnerable, most exposed, most susceptible to the particular wounds that are hardest to heal. And what covers it is not your own righteousness, not your record, not your performance, not the sum of your spiritual accomplishments. The breastplate is the righteousness of Christ placed over your chest, covering what is yours with what is His. This means that the voice that tries to reach your heart tonight with a catalogue of your failures does not get through the armor. It hits something that was never yours to begin with, something that cannot be damaged by your history, because it does not come from your history. Your heart is covered. Let your chest soften under the weight of that covering. The gospel of peace, fitted to your feet like sandals. Sandals are for walking. And the particular readiness that Paul is talking about here is not the readiness of someone braced for impact. It is the readiness of someone who knows where they are going, who has been given a direction, who moves through the world with the particular steadiness of a person whose feet are properly shod for the journey. Peace is not the absence of difficulty. Peace is the particular quality of movement that comes from knowing that the ground you are walking on is solid. Not because the path is always smooth, but because you know whose hands made it and whose hands hold you as you walk it. Let your feet feel that steadiness tonight. The shield of faith. This is the peace Paul describes as able to extinguish all the flaming arrows of the evil one, which is a vivid image, and it is worth staying with. Arrows that are on fire are designed not just to wound but to ignite, to set something burning that will spread, that will do damage beyond the point of impact. The arrows Paul has in mind are the thoughts that catch and spread, the doubt that becomes despair, the discouragement that becomes darkness, the small fear that becomes a consuming anxiety. Faith, held up like a shield, does not mean you do not feel the impact. It means the fire does not spread. It means that the doubt lands and is held, examined, acknowledged, not denied, but does not become the final word, because the shield is not your certainty. It is not your unwavering confidence or your perfectly consistent trust. It is simply faith, the ongoing, sometimes struggling, sometimes barely, their orientation toward the one who chose you before the world was made and has not changed his mind. Even small faith holds a large shield. Let that shield be in your hands tonight. The helmet of salvation. The helmet covers the mind. And the salvation Paul is talking about here as something that protects the mind is the full reality of what has been given. The complete picture. From before the world began to its final completion, of a love that has never been reactive, never been conditional, never been at risk of being withdrawn by anything you have done or left undone. When the mind is covered by this, it means that the anxious spiraling that tends to happen in the dark, the what-ifs and the what-abouts and the what if it is all not true after all, those spirals have somewhere to stop. They hit the helmet. They meet the solid reality of something that was established before your doubts existed and will remain after they have passed through you. Your mind is covered tonight. Let it be still. And the sword of the Spirit, which is the Word of God. This is the one offensive piece in the whole list. And notice what it is. Not argument. Not intellectual force. Not the power of your own conviction or the impressiveness of your theological knowledge. The Word of God, which is to say, the actual words, the ancient, living words that have been finding their way into tired hearts for thousands of years and have never once arrived without bringing something with them. The same words that Paul has been drawing on throughout this letter. The words that say you were chosen before the foundation of the world. That say by grace you have been saved. That say the love of Christ surpasses knowledge. That say be kind to one another, tender-hearted, forgiving one another. These words do not lose their edge with age. They are as sharp tonight as they were in the Lamplit room in Rome where Paul first wrote them. Let them work in you. And then, finally, prayer. Pray in the Spirit on all occasions. Paul says, with all kinds of prayers and requests. Not formal prayer only. Not the carefully worded, publicly presentable kind. All kinds. The prayer that is just a name, just Jesus, breathed out in a moment of exhaustion. The prayer that is just sitting in the dark, not saying anything, simply being present with the one who is present with you. The prayer that is honest about not knowing what to ask for. The prayer that is just thank you, said quietly, for the warmth of a blanket and the sound of breathing nearby, and the fact that the night, however long it is, will eventually give way to morning. Paul asks, at the end, to be remembered in the prayers of the people he loves. He is in prison. He does not know what will happen to him. But he asks not for rescue, not for vindication. He asks that when he opens his mouth, the right words will come, that the mystery he has been entrusted with will continue to be spoken clearly to as many people as there are ears to hear it. He is not afraid. He calls himself an ambassador in chains. And the phrase is not bitter. It is almost amused, in the way that deeply rooted people can sometimes be almost amused by the things that are trying to unsettle them. An ambassador in chains. Still here. Still speaking. Still standing. This is the last image of Paul in this letter. Standing. In the dark, in chains that cannot reach the place where he actually lives. The stars over Ephesus are very bright tonight. The kind of bright that makes the darkness feel less like an absence and more like a presence. A vast, deep, patient presence that has been here since before the first human being looked up at it and wondered. The Aegean is a dark mirror below, and the city is quiet, and the lamps have all gone out, and the people Paul loves are resting. They are wearing the armor, not consciously, not in any way they could explain if someone asked them what they were doing, but underneath their sleep, underneath the quiet breathing and the warmth of their blankets and the small sounds of their houses settling in the night. Underneath all of that, something is standing. Something that does not sleep. Something that was put on them by the love that made them and has never been taken off. You are wearing it too. Right now, in whatever room you are in, with whatever darkness is outside your window and whatever quietness has finally gathered around you tonight, you are wearing it. The truth that holds you together at the center. The righteousness that covers your heart. The peace that steadies your feet. The faith that keeps the fire from spreading. The salvation that covers your mind. The word that is alive in you even while you sleep. You do not have to do anything with it tonight. You do not have to be impressive in it, or maintain it, or prove that you deserve it. You just have to rest inside it. This letter began before the world was made. It began in a decision, a quiet, enormous, entirely unearned decision, made in love, before you existed to be loved. It traveled through centuries, through languages, through the hands of scribes and translators, and ordinary people who passed it to other ordinary people in lamplit rooms across 2,000 years. It found its way, somehow, to tonight, to you, to this particular night, in this particular room, at this particular moment, when you are tired and perhaps a little worn and trying, as faithfully as you can manage, to stand. You are standing. You may not feel like you are standing. You may feel like you are barely holding on, like the ground under you is less solid than you would like the gap between who you are and who you are trying to be is wider tonight than it was this morning. But you are standing. The roots go down further than the feeling of rootlessness goes. The love that chose you is older than the doubt that questions it. The armor that covers you does not require you to feel covered in order to be covering you. So now, let the thoughts begin to slow. The ones that have been circling, let them circle more slowly. Let them lose their urgency. Let them become, gradually, less like problems to be solved and more like clouds moving across a sky that is larger than any of them. Let your body grow heavier. Feel the weight of it, warm and real, pressing gently into wherever you are lying. Feel the specific warmth of your own blanket, your own pillow, the particular familiar comfort of the place where you sleep. Let your breathing find its own rhythm. In and out, in and out. Slow and slower and slower still. The stars over the Aegean are doing what they have always done. Simply being there, constant and unhurried, keeping their ancient watch. The same stars that were there when Paul wrote this letter by lamplight. The same stars that were there before Ephesus was built. Before the first human beings looked up and felt. In the face of that vast and generous darkness, both very small and somehow, mysteriously, very held. You are held tonight. You were held before you knew you needed holding. You will be held when the morning comes and the day begins again with all its ordinary demands and its ordinary beauties and its ordinary opportunities to be, in small and unremarkable ways, the person you are being made into. But that is morning. This is now. And now is for resting. The letter is finished. The armor is on. The love that began before the stars were made is still here. Still present, still unchanging, still, after all of this, choosing you. Rest in that. Let yourself be still. Let your eyes grow heavy and your mind grow quiet and your heart, underneath everything, simply rest in what has always been true. You are chosen. You are loved. You are held. Sleep now.